Okay, looks like there's a handful of participants not yet back from lunch. We'll give it a few more minutes.
I'm back.
Ah, okay.
Hey, Paul, before we start with Napua, can I have just a minute to make an announcement about my new alternative energy staff?
Absolutely. Take the floor.
And before we get going, Paul, are we going to just do Napua Makani today and then the rest of the HCPs and safe harbors tomorrow, or finish all the safe HCPs today?
The rest of them will go tomorrow. That's how it was planned. I left a lot of time today for these particularly because I figured they'd garner a lot of discussion. So the remainder will be for tomorrow.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
Sure. And I know Melissa was supposed to be back on, Kavika and a few others. I kind of like to give them time to join if they're going to.
Yeah, we can hold for a few minutes. That's good.
Okay.
And thanks, Paul, for uploading and sending us those files.
Oh yeah, no worries. I'll try to get the other one sent to you for tomorrow as well. And
Okay,
like, you know, probably upload early next week.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, sorry for that shortcoming. I yeah, was not.
Oh no, no problem. I mean, yeah. Thanks.
You bet. All right, folks, it's about the 5-minute after mark, and if it's good with everyone here, we could probably get started, and hopefully the others will trickle in during the presentation. If I don't have any objections to that, Tom, if you want to take, oh, actually first, no, Darren, you wanted to make an announcement?
Yes, really quickly. Most of y'all know Laisha Lynn Salboso. She's been working on alternative energy HCPs for me and for PIPO for the past about 4 years. Laisha has taken a promotion in our office and is now going to be the lead of our classification team, a brand new team. And I just wanted to let everyone know that the new lead for our alternative energy HCPs is Adrian Willett, and Adrian's been watching the presentations today and will be participating in the HCP meetings from this point forward.
Thanks for that update, and welcome, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here today.
I hope it didn't scare you away.
Not yet.
Okay, I guess with that, yeah, and welcome, Adrian. With that, I guess we can move ahead with Tom and Napua Makani.
Thank you, Paul. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
So for those who might not know me, I'm Tom Stetzinger with Tetra Tech, and I'm presenting on behalf of Napua Makani Power Partners related to HCP compliance for the Napua Makani Wind Project. Project is just outside of Kahuku on the north shore of Oahu. And like the others, we're reporting for FY 2021 and sort of expanding that to include information through December 31st of 2021. So some basic project background. The project consists of 8 Vestas V136 turbines. 4 of those have bat deterrents installed on them. I could talk a little bit more about the specifics of those later. 4 of the turbines are on private ownership. It's sort of a mix of agriculture, as you can see sort of pictured in the photo there. And then 4 are on DLNR ownership, sort of a ridgetop distribution. So the project began vertical construction in October of 2019 and began testing turbine generation in August of 2020 with post-construction mortality monitoring searches occurring concurrently with that beginning of operations. And then commercial operations officially began in December of 2020. The ITL duration is 21-year term, but only 20 of those will be operational. There was sort of a 1-year startup for the period of construction. And we do have an amendment planned that we've had some initial meetings with the agencies on. We're going to amend the permit to include the Hawaiian petrel as an additional covered species based on the observation of a Hawaiian petrel fatality prior to actually any of the turbines being operational. It apparently just flew into a stationary blade or turbine tower. And we're also going to address Hawaiian goose mitigation, given that when we developed the HCP, there was a resident, albeit small, population of Hawaiian geese on the north shore of Oahu, and that population has been extirpated. So we need to consider options relative to that, particularly around mitigation. The agencies have recommended that we continue to keep the Hawaiian goose as a covered species, but trying to sort of create some flexibility in terms of how that mitigation would occur and give us some opportunity to sort of evaluate the actual probability of Hawaiian geese returning to Oahu. So, as I said, ownership of the project is sort of distributed between 2 portions. So on the west side here, we have the DLNR portion with ridgetop turbines that are on a fairly steep ridgetop. So there's really steep terrain heading off to the east and west in both directions, turbines 1 through 4. There's a bat acoustic monitor at ground-based at turbine 1 and turbine 4. And 3 of the deterrents are distributed on this ridge at turbines 2, 3, and 4. On the private ownership, we have turbines 6, 7, 8, and 9. Deterrent installed on turbine 6 and acoustic monitors ground-based at turbine 6 and turbine 9. And then we have office operations and management or operations facilities here just between turbines 8 and 9. And then this is sort of that agricultural area that surrounds these turbines over here. Guess that's it for that one. So in terms of take authorization, we have 8 covered species. Hawaiian hoary bat is the only one with tiers. The upper tier limit for tier 2 is 51. And the planned mitigation is management and a small component of research at the Po'omaho Management Area in the Forest Reserve. Hawaiian short-eared owl has a limit of 4 adults and 4 chicks. Management or research is the mitigation of that, and it was provided through funding to the Endangered Species Trust Fund, and that payment has been made, and a project has been selected by DOFA for the use of those funds. For Newell's Shearwater, there was a contribution to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that is to be used for management of the species, and that project has not been selected yet. For the 4 waterbird species, we're having to adaptive, I guess there are, in terms of take limits, there are take limits for the Hawaiian duck and stilt are 4 birds each, and for the coot and gallinule, they're 8 birds each. And we're having to adaptively manage the program that we had proposed in the original HCP as a result of changes that occurred at Hamakua Marsh, which was that original location. And so we're, and I'll discuss more about that, the actual program that's proposed, but we're planning to do habitat management and predator control and monitoring at Hamakua Marsh. And then, as I said, for the Hawaiian goose, we're going to address that in the HCP amendment. The post-construction mortality monitoring performed at the site consists of weekly searches at standardized search areas at each turbine with canine search teams. We manage the vegetation weekly by mowing immediately after the search is conducted so that there's not any carcasses that could be destroyed in that process. We have an aggressive scavenger control program, and we conduct bias correction trials, and we report fatalities and results consistent with agency protocols. Looking at the post-construction mortality monitoring a little bit more closely, the plots are described as the 75% MBTH plot. The maximum blade tip height for this project is 173 meters. So this 75% MBTH plot, which is this outer area and excludes the inner 50% MBTH plot, the dimensions of this plot are 260 meters by 260 meters. The internal 50% MBTH plot is 173 meters. So it essentially extends the maximum blade tip height across here, or 50% from the center of the turbine to the outer edge of this. So within the 75% area, we're searching all of the roads and paths, and sort of an expanded area beyond that, and that includes some slopes and areas that we can maintain the vegetation. And then all the way out to the edge of that 75%. And then within the 50% plot, we're also including those sort of additional areas around the road and pad where we can maintain that vegetation. We've also identified some supplemental areas that we're currently searching, but not using in our evidence of absence analysis because of some constraints regarding the ability to perform good searches in those areas. In particular, these are crop areas where in some cases there are aggressive dogs that pose a safety hazard to the canine search teams. Occasionally, or I guess as the crops grow over time, they can become unsearchable. And we're currently working with the agencies to identify ways that we can actually start including some of these areas in the evidence of absence analysis. But there are some real challenges there that we're working through with the agencies to make sure that we're doing as robust an analysis and inclusive an analysis of our searching as we can. As we don't have much data yet, we're still relying on a carcass distribution based from the Hull and Muir ballistics analysis, which was what was recommended when we developed the habitat conservation plan. Our analysis of that data is conservative. At every opportunity, we've made conservative assumptions. So we scale the results from that study based on our percent of the maximum blade tip height, so that we're accounting for the larger areas that these turbines, where the distribution of carcasses would occur for these larger turbines. And we assume things, for instance, like that the medium-sized birds are actually large birds, which have a wider distribution, a wider carcass distribution than medium-sized birds based on their modeling. So I wanted to touch briefly on the bias correction trial results from Nipomakani to date. I have included in here results from both the FY 2021 report, as well as information for FY 2022 to date. So this is through Q2 of 2022. The reason I wanted to highlight this is because this came up last year, that when we were doing our report, that we had delays in the arrival of our scavenger traps. So we weren't able to implement those due to those shipping issues until I think it was in February of 2020 that we were able to implement scavenger trapping. And as you can see, in 2021, our probability of persistence until the next search was lower than we would have liked. So it was 0.77. That data there reflects approximately 5 years of no scavenger trapping, and, or sorry, 5 months of no scavenger trapping and 5 months of scavenger trapping. So it's sort of an average of those two. Once we get into 2022, we can see the full effect of the scavenger trapping having taken place. We have had a really aggressive program for the first, I think it was 6 months. We did trapping every week, or reset traps every week. And we're now down to a twice monthly schedule, but maintaining really high levels of carcass persistence until the next search. And like most of these projects that are using canine searches, we have incredibly high searcher efficiency, which is really important in terms of, providing robust estimates.
This is Melissa. I really love seeing that difference between when you weren't doing the trapping and when you were, and it's so rare to see data that can actually give you an idea of how well the trapping is working, because so often people don't have before and after data. I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how this could be used to think about trapping efficacy at other locations, and I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that.
Not really. I mean, I was really pleased that, it showed this really great effect. I think it would be even a starker contrast if we looked merely at those first 5 months from, before we implemented, but we were getting incredible numbers of mongoose, which are the primary scavengers that are at an issue. I think we trapped something like 90 in the first month. I mean, it was just, it was more like 40 per trap session for each of the first four weeks, or even 8 weeks. So it was really, really high numbers of mongoose, and those have reduced. So we do see both the increase in response in terms of carcass persistence. We also see a similar response in terms of what we're seeing in terms of searcher efficiency carcasses. So when we do the searcher efficiency trials, obviously the searchers don't know that those carcasses are going out. They're put out the night before, and during the initial 5 months of the project, a fair number of those carcasses would disappear. And now we're having most of those persist now. So the searcher has every opportunity to find those. So yeah, I think this was a good demonstration of it, but I think reflecting on some of the other presentations, I think that using this measure of carcass persistence is, it is a really useful tool in terms of sort of tracking and recognizing we may need to step up our efforts. So I think this is a good tool for evaluating that, and it's probably a much more direct measure of the effect that we're interested in than trying to look at the populations of predators or something like that.
Tom, two quick questions. Oh, I'm sorry. 2 quick questions. On your SEAF trials, you don't tell people the night that you're going to be putting it out. That's randomized too. Is that correct?
Yes, the proctor is the only one that knows that the carcasses are going out. So they put them out independently of the searcher. The searcher goes through the process of searching and finding carcasses that are there or not.
Yeah, and then the other question is again, I like the thread that Melissa is weaving here, and the connection between your predator control and your probability of persistence. It would be really interesting also to look at the relationship between your probability of persistence and your trap results and see what that kind of relationship is, and that might help others also in terms of how to interpret that data. So just an idea of something to explore.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea.
Sorry, my one follow-up question. I want to make sure that I'm understanding too the potential use of data like these. The point, your range is 0.62 to 0.88 for the probability of persistence. Is the 0.62 essentially a time period in which there was 0 trapping? So it represents almost like a baseline, or how can I view that?
No, that's a confidence interval that's measured around.
Oh.
So this is output from evidence of absence, and it models the carcass persistence and says that on average it's 0.77, but I think it's the 95% confidence interval is between 0.62 and 0.88 based on the I guess the number of carcasses that you've measured. So it's a
okay. And that's based over the course of the entire year. And you said it was 5 months of that you didn't have trapping. Is that correct?
Yes, for the 2021, for the Q2 2022, that's through 6 months, and all of that had trapping in it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there still is quite a bit of overlap between your confidence intervals between those 2 times there, and so I mean it's something I'm sure that you're looking at in terms of whether it's significant or not, and the differences between those. I mean, I realize that's a generated snapshot picture, but when you're comparing those, I mean, you've got to be careful in terms of what you're comparing and how you're comparing it, and make sure that your significance levels and your type 2 and type 2 error is not being violated.
Yeah, part of that issue is just the sample size. We've only had 2 quarters, so we've had a reduced sample size, and I expect that confidence interval will tighten up and remain high.
No, it's good to hear. Good. I'm glad that you're looking at it that way. That's really helpful.
And Tom, did you know that you're going to have trouble with the agricultural areas being searchable when the permit went in place?
We recognized there would be some issues with it, but we thought we would be able to mitigate some of those, for example, by limiting the number of or the types of crops that were grown to allow us to do more robust searching, but that did not actually happen. So the landowner has a conditional use permit that requires the maintaining of those agricultural areas, and we don't have land use control over them. So we're having to work in the context of accommodating that, that agricultural use as it is. One thing we're working on closely with those tenant farmers and the landowner is, continuing to communicate the importance of one, documenting incidental fatalities that they might encounter as they're doing searches or as they're working in their crop areas. So we've created, most of the tenant farmers speak Lao. We've created bilingual materials to share with them to help them report fatalities if they were to find anything. And then we have a landowner has a bilingual staff member who is able to support us in outreach to those people and communicate to them our needs for searching to try to limit the impacts of the dogs that they might have in their farming areas so that we can search more areas. So this is it's an area that we're actively working to try to maximize our ability to perform searches, but it is a really challenging situation. And I think, we've met with Fish and Wildlife Service and DOFA in December to talk through some of those challenges and talk through the, sort of our general thoughts on how we would move forward with this approach, and seem to be receptive or get a receptive response from the agencies. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to roll out this more robust effort that allows us to include some additional areas in the analysis, probably starting in Q3 is what we expect. We're having to bring on another dog searcher to supplement that effort. And again, working closely with the tenant farmers to ensure that we, have their cooperation and that we're able to work, within the limitations that are imposed upon us, and at the same time maintain the safety of the canine search team.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question, Lyle?
Yes, it did.
Tom, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on that one too.
Sure.
And I haven't talked to Leisha about this specifically, so I apologize if I'm asking anything that has already been discussed. If I recall correctly, it was estimated that the searchable area was going to be something along 90% or something in that realm. And it seems like your actual searchable area is substantially below that. I understand the reasons as to why, and it sounds like you're working diligently with the tenant farmers to try and figure out some mechanisms around that. But can you explain a little bit about how that is influencing the way in which that data gets fed into evidence of absence and the level of uncertainty, how that extra level of uncertainty is then informing our assessment of take?
Sure. So yes, the HCP did a preliminary analysis based on the best available information we had at the time, and we estimated that we would be able to search 90% of the bat carcass distribution. That was based on our understanding that we would be able to search these agricultural areas more effectively than we're able to. Right now, we're estimating that we're searching approximately 70% of that carcass distribution instead of 90%. So essentially what evidence of absence will do, because we're looking at the 80% upper credible limit, that's the value that the agencies are using for reporting and for measuring compliance. So we're reporting at that level. The the reduction from 90% of the carcass distribution to 70% of the carcass distribution reduces our confidence of the actual estimate. So that increases the uncertainty. And so there's a possible amplification of that 80% upper credible limit. So if you're doing a really poor job of searching, and let's say you search 20% of the carcass distribution, jumping ahead of myself, but right now we're estimating the take for the observed bat fatality that we had at 3 + 1 indirect. If we were searching 20% of the carcass distribution, that might be 5. So what it does is sort of increases that uncertainty and sort of recognizes that we're less confident about our estimate. So in this case, moving from 70% to 90% probably doesn't have an effect on the one, the one observed fatality at this point. I haven't run it differently to see what that would look like, but it probably wouldn't change it. But over time, it's possible that could change the overall estimate of take by a few bats over an extended period of time. I have done a preliminary analysis that shows that with this 70% percent of carcass distribution that we're looking at, we can still provide a good estimate that would allow the project to come in under the tier 1 limit over the project life with the same kind of observed fatality rate that we've seen to date, albeit that we only have, a year and a half of observations at this point.
Thanks, Tom. I guess I would just say that please keep us in the loop on how those plans for increasing searchable area progress if they can. If it turns out that the searchable area cannot be increased, I feel like there's probably some room in there to have additional conversations about other parameters that could be increased that would reduce uncertainty elsewhere.
Okay, yeah, we're like I said, we're working diligently with the canine search team, the tenant farmers, really trying to figure out a way to do this in a way that is supported through the statistical analysis, but are completely on board with having the agencies review that process and make sure that everybody's on board with it.
I only raise it because for new projects, typically we try and reduce the uncertainty as much as we can within the first 3 years, so we have a reasonable assessment of what the search radius should be and where the uncertainty really lies, and then that informs potential reductions in monitoring or refinement of monitoring in subsequent years. But to start out a new project with a high degree of uncertainty is, it makes for a very hard implementation and monitoring schedule for the HCP as a whole. So thanks for all of your efforts to try and refine this. Look forward to hearing more over the next couple months.
Okay, thank you. So regarding avoidance and minimization, the project is implementing low wind speed curtailment for wind speeds below 5 meters per second from March through November. As I said, there were deterrents installed on 4 of the turbines. These became operational in September 2020. So just during the testing phase of the project, and there certainly were post-construction mortality monitoring searches going on throughout that period. We did select the location for those deterrents based on proximity to edge habitat, which we viewed as probably the most risky turbines. And as you're probably aware, there was an additional incidental take license restriction placed on the project to do a research plan related to the efficacy of deterrence. And we're working on the development of that plan in consultation with DOFA. We do have acoustic monitoring at 4 turbines. As I said, those were ground-based. And the selection of those locations were based to capture a range of conditions, as include varying agricultural conditions, varying sort of availability of edge habitat, and sort of the DLNR ownership versus the private ownership. Regarding the effectiveness of the deterrence, a single observed bat fatality occurred at turbine 6, which did have an active deterrent on it and was implementing low wind speed curtailment. This was, I think it was September 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, for the bat fatalities. So it was outside of the bat breeding season, when there shouldn't be indirect take associated with that fatality, but there, but it was, you know, before the termination of low wind speed curtailment in November. And you know, one of the key things that we're looking at in terms of that research plan is looking at the effectiveness of these deterrents. So we hope to tie together the actual post-construction mortality monitoring associated with deterrence versus the non-deterrence, and incorporate information from acoustic monitoring to look at potential risk, and look at habitat and other things to try to better understand the effectiveness of the deterrence on the site.
Tom?
Yeah.
Could you go back there just a second? Yeah, no, again, I mean, I think it would be really worthwhile to find a way to include the ESRC in the discussion, particularly in terms of the deterrent research plan, because that relates very directly to what the BAT task force has been doing with the revisions of the guidance document. And you know, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page on that. And it's better to do it as a group rather than, you know, different efforts that we figure out how to tie together later on. So that's just one question. The second question is are the deterrent units that you're using, are they the same as are being used at Kauailoa and Oahe, or is it a different model?
They are the same. So they're the NRG system. The deployment is different at Nipoamakani. There are 6 deterrent units on the turbines. They similarly have you know, an overlapping spatial distribution. So there is redundancy among those deterrent units, but because the turbines are larger, there are 6 units that are deployed on each turbine.
Okay, thanks.
So just a quick snapshot of the results of the BAT acoustic monitoring to date. This is from the annual report and does not include information from the June, July, August, September period, because the reporting period sort of ended in May and didn't start until September. So that's September 2020, essentially, when the acoustic monitors were deployed. And then we finished up in May of 2020 for the FY 2020, or sorry, May of 2021 for the FY 2021 report. I have looked at the other information, and just as a synopsis, what we see is peaks in activity in September and or peaks in acoustic acoustic detections in September and August, a decline in July and October, and then very low acoustic activity rates between November and June. And this is very similar to what they see at the Kahuku wind farm as well. So very low activity rates and at the site. And obviously we'll be continuing to perform this monitoring. And so we should get additional information over time, but we fully expect that this will reflect the same patterns that have been observed at the Kahuku project and other projects where we see these higher levels of activity in late lactation, post-lactation period, and then low activity outside of that. I will highlight that even during the peak activity or peak acoustic detection periods, we're only seeing 1 to 2 detections per night. So it's not a lot of detections occurring during those evening hours. Rather, there's sort of single or double detections, but mostly singles.
Just for comparison, the ones on Maui were finding over 1 detection. Sorry, they were much higher proportion of nights with detections, correct? Yeah,
this Napua Makani is seeing similar values, maybe a little bit elevated from what Kahuku has, which really has really low acoustic detection rates. The Maui projects had much higher rates, as I think Kauailoa does as well.
Okay, so just to kind of see the patterns in my head, much lower take on Oahu and much lower detections on Oahu, much higher take on Maui, much higher detections on Maui as a general pattern, right?
I don't know that I would classify it that way. Yeah.
No? Okay.
And before deterrents were up in Kauailoa, that was a very high take area.
Right.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Different. Yeah, Tom, one sort of comment. I look at this diagram, and we've seen the same thing for Oahe and KWP 1 and 2 and the other sites and so forth. And each of these analyses is done for your very limited number of detectors at that one particular site, and looking at that. I mean, ideally, it would be really nice, particularly in a case like this. I mean, you've got 3 facilities right next to each other, Kahuku, this, and Kauailoa in the same general area, which is certainly, I mean, they're not different populations of bats. I mean, they move around so much, and it would be really nice for a, more of a meta-analysis also to be able to look at that to see whether there's, correspondence between the numbers that you're seeing in these different areas, and that may, strengthen, the power of the analysis a little bit more. And then to take it a step further, one of the things that is being suggested in the draft of the revised guidance document is to, assuming we could have more long-term monitoring sites such as the West study on the different islands, is to ensure that the acoustic monitoring at each of the facilities also can serve, is monitored in a similar way and can serve as another data point within that meta network for those. And that would strengthen, again, our picture of sort of the island-wide or the more regional assessment of bat detectability across the area. So anyway, just trying to see, I mean, that's part of the rationale in terms of getting away from just the 4 detectors in one area and 3 over here and so forth, is how can we combine those and get a much better picture regionally in terms of what the bat populations are doing over time.
Yeah, no, understood. I mean, I think just from my perspective, I think we need information on the kind of questions we're trying to answer in terms of framing how a meta-analysis or, including multiple projects in these figures would, what kind of information would we be getting from that? I certainly see feeding this information into sort of a larger regional monitoring program. I think that, if that can be done, that makes absolute sense to be able to really monitor over landscape scale areas. I think that makes great sense. So I wanted to touch on the invasive plant species monitoring and management program as well. So part of the habitat conservation plan required that we do annual surveys of construction areas for chromalina, that's devilweed, fireweed, and fountain grass. No, well, I guess the actual HCP required the monitoring for devilweed. Fireweed and fountain grass have also been identified as potential invasive species of concern, so we've included those in our monitoring protocols. To date, we haven't had any fireweed or fountain grass detected. However, devilweed was detected in December 2020 survey, which included 3 of our standardized search areas. And in November 2021, we surveyed the same locations and found the plant persisted and now occurs at the Turbine 4 standardized search area as well. When we developed the habitat conservation plan, we consulted with the Oahu Invasive Species Committee, and they advised us that the devilweed was already well established in the area prior to the project. They recommended hand removal and spraying. However, spraying has been raised as a significant concern by our canine search teams. So the way that we've been managing it is hand removal and spraying outside of the canine or outside of the search areas, and doing post-search cleaning of the dogs and boots to make sure that we're minimizing the risk of spread to other project areas. And we are exploring additional control measures that are compatible with our canine searchers' concerns. We do maintain through low mowing the devilweed in a state where it's not producing seed or flower, but we recognize this is a concern, and we're trying to figure out a way to address it that allows us to continue searching on schedule, and we'll certainly keep you in the loop on any additional methods we can identify that will allow us to take a more aggressive stance in the areas where we have land use control. Just, I guess, one final point on that. The OISC did relay to me, and I'm not sure, I haven't had an update of this recently, that they are working on permitting a biocontrol for devilweed, and planning on releasing that. I think when I last talked to them, which was about a year ago, they thought it was probably a year or 2 out, but I will try to follow up with them to better understand what the status of that program is. So looking to the summary of takes, so for the HCP covered species, the only species with observed take is the Hawaiian hoary bat. The one observed fatality occurred, I think it was September 22nd of 2021, so not in the FY 2021 period. And the total estimated take through December 31st of 2021 at that 80% upper credible limit, and including an estimate of indirect take, is 4. The indirect take, as I mentioned sort of tangentially earlier on, the actual observed fatality occurred outside of the period where we would expect females to have dependent young, which ends, I think, September 15th. The fatality occurred September 22nd, so there isn't any indirect take associated with that observed fatality. We don't know what the sex was yet, but regardless, there should be no indirect take associated with that. So the indirect take that's estimated is associated with the 2 unobserved direct take that are accounted for or calculated through evidence of absence. And then that 1 indirect take is a rounded up value. The actual value is around 0.2, I think, for that estimate of indirect take. For the MBTA species, observed fatalities between July 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2021. We've had one wedge-tailed shearwater, one Pacific golden plover, 3 cattle egrets, 2 of which occurred during the FY 2021 period, and 2 house finches. Moving on to a discussion of the mitigation. So just as a reminder from the Habitat Conservation Plan, the mitigation area plan for the Hawaiian bat was the Paumoho Ridge area of the Ava Forest Reserve. This is a sort of mid to high elevation forest area with threats to bat habitat, including feral ungulates and invasive plants. The plan is to, for tier 1, is to focus on management of the area. So this includes invasive plant species removal and monitoring and repairing and the ungulate-proof fence that exists in the area, maintaining that, and also providing a small research plan that accompanies the management plan. Both of these were recently submitted for agency review, and we believe they are responsive to conversations that we've had with the agencies regarding what the needs for the monitoring, the measures of success, adaptive management, and the key components that are now regularly a part of these habitat conservation plans. We also work closely with the Ko'olau Mountain Watershed Partnership to ensure that this plan would be implementable by that group, because funding is planning to go through that process or through that organization. And in addition, as mentioned earlier, we're working on a $100,000 deterrent study that was required under the incidental take license, and that we've gotten initial input from DOFA on that, and we'll be sharing a draft of that with DOFA and presumably passed on to the ESRC in the near future.
I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but I mean, as the plan was being developed, I mean, this has been several years in the development, and it's been on the ESRC table several times. And I know we had a whole lot of discussion about the management options and mitigation options and so forth. And I guess this is more directed at Fish and Wildlife Service and or the agencies, I guess, as they're being called. It's a bit frustrating to be on the ESRC and having had those initial discussions to then have to wait for agency review. I mean, it just makes more sense to, again, take advantage of the biological expertise of the committee. That's what we're for, to help develop these plans. And I realize that in certain circumstances, you don't want to have things go out to the public before they're really ready, but I don't know how else we can do it, because again, I mean, I'm just concerned in terms of sort of the potential step back in time after if the plan comes to the ESRC and we've got some real major questions about it or suggestions or ways to improve it and so forth, that it's going to sort of slow down the process. We'd like to see this get going faster, but anyway, I just want to sort of vent a little bit of my frustration on that, and I'm just trying to make it so it's more effective and efficient for all of us to be able to realize the conservation value of the mitigation, and the more we can streamline that process, the better.
No, understood, Jim. So touching on the Pueo and Newell Shearwater mitigation programs, as described earlier, funding was provided to DOFA's Endangered Species Trust Fund, and a research project was selected covering breeding ecology of the Pueo. and funding was provided to National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The project where that funding will go is pending selection. For waterbirds, the map here shows the original proposed plan, which was the installation of a fence at Hamakua Marsh and providing staffing and sort of public outreach to reduce the risk of Hawaiian waterbirds being killed in the parking area at the mall there. The situation has changed since the approval of the Habitat Conservation Plan, in that there was plantings put in that reduced that risk essentially down to nothing. And I think plans for modification of the area where that fence line was proposed to go. As a result, it was recognized that there was a need for adaptive management. Our plan continues to be to work in the Hamakua Marsh area. We've consulted closely with the Oahu branch of DOFA and Fish and Wildlife Service in DOFA to identify a program that will sort of deal with habitat management, predator control, and monitoring in this area.
Sorry, I just have a comment. Oh, but go ahead and finish with this. I'm sorry, finish with this slide, and then I have a comment.
Sure, I was just going to say that, so there was the recognition of the need for that adaptive management. We have submitted a draft plan to wildlife agencies, received comments from DOFA and verbal comments from Fish and Wildlife Service during our last meeting, and have incorporated those into a revised draft that we're finalizing and should submit early this quarter for additional agency review.
Okay, sorry for interrupting. Thank you so much. And I see that I can't tell if Afshin is still on this call or not. She might be the best person to speak to this. And certainly what I'm going to speak to is not published yet, but Hamakua is doing very well as far as the 3 waterbirds that are managed there. It's a very successful site. And in fact, our nesting cameras are showing that there's quite a bit of even intra-specific nest predation or inter-specific between the waterbirds, where they'll go to the nearest nest and peck the eggs and basically say, you know, you're too close, get further away, which suggests they're reaching carrying capacity. And again, this is data hot off the press. We're not published yet on this. And so the goal of mitigation is to provide a net plus for a site so that it makes up for those that are killed elsewhere. And again, I think Afshin probably is better to speak to this than I don't want to put you on the hot seat, Tom, with this one. But as far as speaking to whether Hamakua is the best site, because I think there's many other sites that really need management, but Hamakua seems to be getting maybe maxed out for capacity. So just want to provide that comment.
No, I appreciate that input, and I'll pause for Afshin if she wants to jump in here, but I would just, yeah, that's new information for us. It's certainly worth us pursuing that thread to better understand if we have reached carrying capacity there. My understanding from talking with Aaron and Jason regarding Hamakua Marsh is that they felt there was still a need for better understanding how to implement predator control effectively and effective management of the vegetation. I think is still sort of working out the nuances there to maximize the production of the area. So it was our understanding that they felt pretty confident that there was still an opportunity to provide a lift above that baseline, but I think it's worth continuing that conversation and bringing that perspective to the table as well.
And totally fair. And it's always a little nerve wracking to mention something that isn't out in publication yet and that we're just still analyzing the data. But my team has essentially said that, you know, we've had maybe 5-6 years of nest monitoring with nest cameras. And in the early years, we really didn't see that waterbird on waterbird nest predation. And we're seeing more of it within the last couple of years. So it just kind of brought it to my attention, and we kind of scratched our heads and went, well, maybe we're reaching carrying capacity. So just wanted to mention that we do have studies that are ongoing this year, not with funding from you guys, but from I think U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant that Lindsay Nietman got at the site that is looking at predator stuff. We're looking at habitat management and doing a pretty intensive study of that should be done within the next 2 years. But as far as sites go, I can see a bigger bang for the buck, a bigger gain potentially at maybe other sites. But again, I would defer to the waterbird folks at that site because they're on the ground every single day. So I don't want to overstep my bounds on that. Just want to note what we're seeing on the cameras.
No, appreciate.
I will interject that Afshin is not on the call, but she did say that we will follow up on this with you, Melissa, and others. So she would like to speak with the branch staff first, though.
Super important. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd like to add something too. I mean that there's 4 basins basically that we manage at Hamakua, and some are better than others. I think there's gains that we can still be made. And we still have some issues with predator control, and some of the prescriptions on vegetation management, I think could use work. But in terms of densities, at least on the Basin C, you know, they're really good, and you do get into interspecific competition or interspecies competition in certain areas. And again, from what I've seen, you could make gains there, but I would go back again to Kawanui, which is essentially right next door, and you know there's like 11 different ponds there that could be managed as individual units, and there's lots of gains to be made there.
Agreed. Thanks, Dave.
Great. Yes, thank you, Dave. So just touching on Nene. So we've had mitigation planning meetings with the agencies. As I'm sure you're all aware, the species is no longer present on Oahu, and there are no planned translocations. In addition, there are some changed conditions at James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. There was some fencing installed in areas that had been proposed as potential fencing options as mitigation for the project, but also recognizing that those benefits from those fencing projects wouldn't likely have a direct impact on Nene since they're not there. We have talked at length and sort of come back to this question a few times with the agencies. As I said earlier, their recommendation is for us to consider or to continue keeping the Nene as a covered species because of the potential for the species to come back to the island within the permit term, although there are no planned activities that would sort of promote that. And then to try to create some flexibility in terms of how that mitigation would be performed. So off island with some opportunity for deferring that mitigation for a time period as we continue to evaluate the risk of Nene actually returning to Oahu seems to be the consensus. And obviously that'll be a topic for discussion as a part of the Habitat Conservation Plan amendment. So just to touch on sort of adaptive management and agency coordination, for the Hawaiian hoary bat, we've been working with DOFA on identifying an appropriate deterrent study. We have deployed deterrents on 4 of the wind turbines, and we are planning for submittal early in this quarter to DOFA for review and believe as a part of the habitat conservation plan, just referencing your comments here, Jim, that the ESRC would be involved in reviewing that that deterrent study. That seems to be referenced directly in the ITL condition. So I think you can expect to provide input on that. For the bat mitigation program, as I said, there's a plan in review, and we've coordinated with the agencies on this, and as well as the Kalama Watershed Partnership. For waterbirds, we've continued to coordinate with the agencies, including Oahu branch or DOFA Oahu branch staff, to identify appropriate measures that can be implemented. We do view this as adaptive management in the sense that it is modifying a plan that was described in the Habitat Conservation Plan and requires agency review for approval. For the NENE, as I said, we're working on that as a part of the major amendment. And then just in terms of post-construction mortality monitoring, we've identified these limitations on our ability to perform high-quality searches in the agricultural areas and are working closely with the agencies and the landowner to identify ways that we can increase the areas where we're actually performing those analyses to increase confidence in our estimates. So future plans, we'll continue to do our post-construction mortality monitoring and bat acoustic monitoring, as well as the invasive plant species monitoring, working on review and approval and implementation of the mitigation plans, as well as the deterrent study, and continue our reporting. Just in a little bit more depth, working, as I said, like reiterating a lot of this. So these are our key priority items for working with the agencies and getting these programs off the ground. So the bat mitigation and deterrent research, the waterbird mitigation plan, getting agency buy-off on revisions to the post-construction mortality monitoring plan, where we identify some additional areas that we can use in our evidence of absence analysis, and then working on the habitat conservation plan amendment. So we're working to coordinate with DOFA and Fish and Wildlife Service on NEPA and HEPA requirements and starting a draft of that amendment during this quarter.
Can you remind me what that amendment entails?
Yeah, the two key areas that we're looking at are adding Hawaiian petrel as a covered species and addressing the concern about Hawaiian goose. So looking at alternative mitigation off island and a deferral of that mitigation while the agencies and the permittee can consider what the likely continued risk of the species is at an Oahu project.
Okay. You may also want to consider your searchable area information at that time too. I don't know if that's come up in conversations, but it might be worth considering for inclusion in the amendment.
Yeah, we have looked at that. We think that we can address that effectively outside of the amendment, and would, I think we'd like to have a plan in place that we can implement and are working on. So I think we can consider that if it's deemed necessary, but from my perspective, I think that we should be able to work through that process without including it in the amendment. We can continue those conversations.
And then just for the ESRC's benefit, I wanted to relay that on the Fish and Wildlife Service side anyway, we had given approval for them to hold off on doing Nene mitigation unless and until Nene showed back up on Oahu, while it is a covered species. As you just heard Tom mention, they are considering removing it as a covered species as part of the amendment. But at least right now, while it is a covered species, we did not, there is not an expectation on the Fish and Wildlife Service side for them to continue to implement the mitigation action as of yet for Nene. Tom, did I say that?
Yeah, I guess I would clarify that we, at this point, based on the input from the agencies, we are planning on keeping it in. We're not planning on dropping it as a covered species. We're planning on keeping it in.
Okay.
Urban mitigation, I think we recognize there are challenges in having it listed as a covered species and not at some point providing mitigation for it. And I think that's a topic that we have to navigate and make sure that we're all on the same page. Because I see that as a potential challenging area that I think we need input from the state, need input from Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that we're actually meeting sort of all of the requirements.
But the intent is certainly with the amendment to cover Hawaiian petrel.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
So this is Loyal. I have a question or two.
Sure.
So the rotor diameter on these are pretty good size. They're what, 130 meter rotor rotor diameter, is that right?
Yeah, 136, I think.
136, okay. And when you're doing the low wind speed curtailment on those, are you taking the cue on when to curtail from wind meters that are mounted on the nacelle or ones that are mounted off the nacelle on the ground?
On the nacelle.
On the nacelle, okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for the good discussion.
Great. Thanks and appreciate everybody's input on this.
Thank you.
All right. I guess that's it then for the day, unless there's more discussion. Again, I'm not sure what we do when we conclude a day.
I think you or Dave just calls it to a closure, and since we're not voting, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
But so we're starting tomorrow at 9. Is that right?
Starting tomorrow at 9. Yeah.
And it's and make sure everybody knows it's a different Zoom address, right? Link.
It is a different Zoom address. Yeah, it's in that email. It's the second one in the email.
Right.
And
So
Paul,
Dave, should
briefly, can you run us through the schedule for tomorrow morning?
Sure. The schedule tomorrow morning, I don't know if it'll be in this exact order, but we're hoping to start out with Kenai Industrial Park. That's our Acaranthes HCP. Then move on to Albutilon, which will be basically the HDOT, Albutilon HCP. It'll basically be a final report because that project is technically POW. Susan Ching will be presenting that. Next will be Hokuala HCP, and then there'll be just a handful of safe harbors and Sinotech. So safe harbors, that's Kamehameha Schools SHA and the Maui Nui SHAs.
And do we have the annual reports for those? Were those sent as well, or did we just receive the wind ones today?
I'm going to send you those after this meeting. And
Thank you so much.
As I told Jim earlier, I'll get those posted. I don't know if I'll get them posted by tomorrow, but I'll have them up early next week at the website. I apologize for that.
No worries, thank
No
you.
problem.
And Paul, what's the date for the KSHCP?
Ooh. You know, I don't have that off the top of my head. Dave, do you have that date by chance?
I do not.
All right, thank you.
Hang on, I'm looking for it. I think
So I can also-
February 18th was potentially an ESRC day for forest birds, but I don't know if that's sticking or not. And then
I don't have a date for it. I just,
Yeah, remind me what that one is.
the
Yes,
seabird, Hawaii
That's the
seabird.
light attraction.
Oh, okay. I was thinking KS coming out of my school. So that's where I was confused. Sorry.
Yeah, it's true. Sorry.
I was going to say, wait a minute, what did they do? They changed. I always thought that should have been a HCP anyway, but that's another story.
I wanted to add to that the forest bird presentation for the 18th, that is currently on hold. That again, that's what Kate suggested I mention, if anything.
yeah, and I knew that that was a possibility. I don't think I have, Paul, I don't think we have a date for the March KSHCP meeting on our calendars yet.
Okay.
Given how quickly ESRC members' calendars fill up, particularly Dave's, might be good to get it on that on the schedule sooner rather than later.
Okay, that's Kate. So I will talk with her after this meeting.
I would
don't-
actually make a similar request for if we have meetings in April and May, I'll just say my calendar is filling through May right now. It'd be really nice to get those blocked out sooner rather than later.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Are we done for the day?
I believe so.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Paul and Dave for leading us through with this.
Yeah, Paul, good job.
Thanks a lot.
And to everybody who did the presentation, that was really good. It was very informative.
Thank you all. It was a good meeting.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Yep.
I
thanks a
am.
lot.
Well,